So we just had the final night of the Republican National Convention, wrapping up 2 busy weeks of conventions between the DNC and the RNC. So I want to take a pause, take a few minutes to sort of break down the RNC and compare it to the DNC. What are the things that we can learn about the respective parties and who they're trying to message to, and what kinds of things can we take out of that so that we can understand the race better moving forward. But the first thing I want to do is sort of talk a little bit about Donald Trump's speech from last night. Now, a lot of people were understandably criticizing Donald Trump's speech because it was coming out of the White House. They were arguing that this possibly violates the Hatch Act or other kinds of rules prohibiting government resources from being expended on campaigns. Now, I'm going to be honest with you guys, I don't think that this is the kind of criticism, the kind of media criticism, which is going to really land on Donald Trump. I'm going to break that down further in just a few minutes here. But first of all, just a few general facts about the speech. It was the longest speech that we've seen from a presidential candidate at a convention since World War II, the second longest that we've seen since World War II. And this is notable when compared to Joe Biden's speech, who was one of the shortest speeches that we've seen in recent presidential history on a campaign trail. Now, this, of course, plays into some of the major messaging that we've seen from the Trump campaign and seen throughout the course of the RNC, which is that Joe Biden is generally incompetent. That's the message that the RNC and that the Republican Party and that Donald Trump specifically is trying to play in. They're trying to play, into this idea of sleepy Uncle Joe, that Joe Biden's sleepy, he's not really up to the task, he doesn't have the sort of high energy. And so Donald Trump trying to come out, give a long speech is one of the ways in which the Trump campaign is trying to really double down on this idea that Donald Trump has the energy to handle the job. Now, there's some major concerns with that strategy as well, which is that a long speech, especially in the case of this one, it didn't really have the kind of major flowing structure. Now, that's not because it was just Donald Trump rambling. This was a pre-written speech. Now, it was a live speech. Most of the things that we saw from the RNC, or at least very many of the things which we saw from the RNC and as well from the DNC, were pre-recorded. Now, this, of course, led to a lot of concerns where they weren't really able to react live to things that were going on right now. So we saw Hurricane Laura coming in. We also saw the shooting of Jacob Blake. And, the RNC wasn't really able to react to that in a way that a normal convention may be able to, right? Because so much of it was pre-recorded, pre-scripted. And that was one of the major limitations that we saw from this medium. Now, of course, a lot of that was instituted because of the coronavirus, but nonetheless, though, that was one major weakness that we saw. And again, that same weakness did also apply to the DNC there. But I do think that, when it comes to this long speech, especially in the case of this one, where there wasn't that kind of structure, even though it was pre-written, it led to a kind of grab bag, right? There was a lot of different messaging. There wasn't a clear, coherent message that Donald Trump was really giving. It was just this thing, that thing, and the other thing. And I think that that actually goes to a deeper point, which I want to make, which is that we also saw it reported in, I talked about it in my last video discussing the RNC, that the Republican Party came out basically more or less admitting beforehand that they did not have a thorough strategy on who they wanted to target. They weren't sure. They're down in the polls right now, and so what they were trying to do is just do a grab bag. And so in a certain sense, the whole thing was a massive spitball, and they were just trying to see what stuck. Now, that's not necessarily a bad strategy in a certain sense, right? Like, if you don't know what messaging is going to really stick, what kind of messaging is really going to land, well, then you've got to sort of throw out different things and see what thing sticks best, see what thing pulls the best afterwards. Now, one of the major sort of innovations that we did see from the Trump campaign during this RNC is the idea of Beijing Biden. That's one of the hits that the RNC was really doubling down on, and it really brings together a lot of the criticisms of the Trump campaign that they've been trying to level against Joe Biden. A lot of it hasn't been sticking so far. We'll have to see whether or not it does start to stick going into the future, which is that Beijing Biden brings in the idea of the coronavirus, and it tries to link the coronavirus to Joe Biden somehow, even though, I mean, it doesn't really work like factually, but that's sort of what they're trying to do. And then also Beijing Biden connecting that communist strand of things where we saw a million times over from the RNC calling, Joe Biden just the party, from the party of Bernie Sanders, AOC trying to suggest that Joe Biden wants to defund the police, which factually just is not true. Joe Biden has distanced himself from defunding the police. That's not a view that I necessarily hold, but that's the view which Joe Biden is actively espousing, that he he's not interested in, defunding the police or anything like that. But that's the sort of strategy that the RNC is really trying to come to. This Beijing Biden seems to encapsulate a lot of the other criticisms that they're trying to do into one word. Now, I said I was going to come back to the Hatch Act there, because the Hatch Act is actually one of the interesting things, right? And why I don't think that these kind of media criticisms that we've seen over the past 24 hours are going to be particularly successful. So the Hatch Act essentially is the law which prohibits federal employees from engaging in political activities while on the job, and it has rarely led to the firing of political appointees. We're going to get to that in just a second for why that's the case. But a lot of people were making criticisms about the Hatch Act on basically every night of the convention, especially the second, third, and fourth nights of the convention. But so, for instance, Melania Trump on the second night on Tuesday, delivering her convention addresses from the Rose Garden, some people are arguing that that was using government resources. In my opinion, though, I think that one did have a little bit of plausible deniability. It's like, hey, look, COVID's going on, like, whatever, right? But then we also saw Secretary of State Mike Pompeo delivering a convention address from Israel while on a diplomatic trip to the Middle East. And then we saw Mr. Trump and other officials taking part in a naturalization ceremony and giving a presidential pardon as convention cameras rolled. A lot of people were saying that one took it a little bit too far. Now, actually, first, let me just show you this real quick about the enforcement of the Hatch Act, and then I'll get to why I don't think that those criticisms are really going to land on Donald Trump. So who enforces the Hatch Act? The law is enforced by the Office of Special Counsel, an independent agency which enforces civil service laws governing federal employees. And while violations of the Hatch Act are intended to be a fireable offense, that outcome has been exceedingly rare in modern politics. And here's the key word here: by most legal interpretations, the president is the only person who can terminate political appointees for violating the law. So in many respects, first of all, the president and the vice president are sort of kind of above the Hatch Act in a certain sense. Like, you can still kind of get them in trouble, but there isn't really like a clear enforcement mechanism. So there's a bit of a glitch in the law about whether or not any kind of real enforcement can ever happen, right? Like, you'd need to sort of rearrange the way that the law is structured in order to make it a truly enforceable offense. And second of all, so the reason why I don't think that this is going to be particularly damaging to President Trump is just that right now what we're seeing is, if you look at the polling right now, Donald Trump is particularly weak when it comes to COVID, right? Like, that's the criticism which is actually landing on Donald Trump really significantly. And in fact, it's also the issue which voters are saying right now is the most important issue. So if you start distracting the news cycle and start talking about the Hatch Act, something which honestly a lot of voters probably don't really know about, probably don't really care about, then it's just going to lead to a situation where voters are going to be considering the election in light of the Hatch Act, which is going to be a much closer to a 50-50 issue, if that at all, compared to COVID, where Donald Trump is clearly weak, and also where right now voters who are saying that they are focusing in on COVID, which is the majority right now, are going against Donald Trump. So I don't think that arguing from the Hatch Act would be an effective thing for the media in terms of like taking down Donald Trump. I think that if the media starts talking about the Hatch Act, I actually think that Donald Trump would probably start to go up in the polls, and it would end up simulating a convention bump, which is exactly what I think the RNC was trying to do. I don't think that these things were by accident. I don't think that Donald Trump was trying to, just unintentionally, break norms by coming out speaking from the White House. I don't think that Melania Trump was unintentionally trying to break norms by speaking from the Rose Garden. Now, look, I'm not necessarily saying that I think that those things are the worst ever. Like, this is a coronavirus pandemic. They had to make accommodations, right? Like, I understand that some modifications needed to happen, so I'm not necessarily like mad at the fact for in and of itself, right? But I do think that, it probably was intentional, right? Like, I do think that the RNC intentionally was trying to distract the media and start running a news cycle about the Hatch Act, because that would mean, of course, that it could simulate a convention bump. Like, anything that you can do to distract from COVID for Donald Trump is a good thing. Right? That's just what we've seen, right? If Donald Trump can distract from COVID, Donald Trump is going to go up in the polls more or less, because that's where Donald Trump is super, super, super weak, right? Republicans right now, their main strategy depends on, in some respects, praying to God, because they want to hope either A, COVID really starts improving for America, or B, that Americans can just sort of distract and start forgetting about COVID and move on to other stuff. And we really saw that at the convention, where Donald Trump didn't necessarily have a clear message about the coronavirus. They really didn't. They didn't have a clear or plausible story about it. It was sort of just, what they tried to do was focus in on the economy, which was of course the thing that they were going to run on anyway pre-COVID. That was their strategy. They were going to run on how great the economy was. And in fact, still, if you look at the polling right now, Donald Trump still polls decently well in terms of like, who do you think does well with the economy? Voters, for whatever reason, still have this attachment to the idea that Donald Trump is really good with the economy. And so if Donald Trump focuses in on the economy and we're like, well, yes, COVID is really something that we're struggling with, but now we're starting to move past COVID and we're trying to reopen the economy, the hope of the Republican Party is that voters will go into the voting booth thinking, well, I need someone who's good with the economy so we can get it back roaring. Now, I'm not sure that that's necessarily like true that Donald Trump is great with the economy, but that's what a lot of voters think. And that's why we saw at the convention constantly talking about how Donald Trump had created this great economy. Donald Trump is good with the economy. We saw it from multiple speakers, because you'd think, right? You would think that during a time when voters are really struggling, when people are really struggling right now, that you wouldn't mention how Donald Trump is great with the economy. But it turns out that what they're trying to do is reshift that, re-angle that in terms of a light at the end of the tunnel. Well, think about the economy. Think about the economy, and then you'll know who to pick. That's what the RNC is trying to do right now. That's one of their major strategies. And also the other major strategy that we saw is how the RNC is trying to tackle their concern about the suburbs, right? Because the suburbs, of course, has been swinging over to Democrats for the past couple years now since the election of Donald Trump. In 2018, that's how the Democrats managed to take the House, by winning a number of seats in the suburbs. And the RNC is really trying to tackle this by this idea that Democrats want to destroy the suburbs. We saw, for instance, the McCloskeys, which is the gun couple. I made a video about it maybe just a few days ago, maybe yesterday. I'm not quite sure when this is going to end up getting uploaded. But with the McCloskeys, where they really tried to hone in on was single-family zoning. They tried to say, for instance, that by ending single-family zoning, it's going to lead to poor people or undesirable people coming into the suburbs, and that's going to destroy the suburb way of life. So they're really trying to mix in their messaging in terms of immigration, in terms of undesirables coming into the country, and mix that into the idea of poor people, of minorities coming into the suburbs and destroying the suburb way of life. Now, no doubt to say, I had a lot to say about that in my video where I talked about the McCloskeys. I thought that there was a lot of problem. I thought that messaging was very problematic, but that's the strategy which the RNC is trying to run with, right? They want to try to take back the suburbs, and what they're trying to do is say how the Democrats are going to destroy the suburb way of life, right? So, but the ironic thing about that, of course, is that right now the reason why the suburbs are swinging so hard for Democrats is because of the fact that Donald Trump is seen as, the Republican Party is seen as racist. And so even among voters who might support a lot of the policies of the Republican Party, they might support tax cuts, they might support deregulation, but what they don't want to do, what they definitely don't want to do, is support a party that is perceived as being racist. Right? And so I find it a little bit ironic that that's the strategy which they're trying to do to try to win back the suburbs, right? Because again, the reason why they're losing the suburbs is because even people who may agree with the Republican Party on all the tax cut policies in the world, they still don't want to vote for a party that socially is perceived as being racist. And so by dog whistling and making messaging about how undesirables, about how poor people are going to come into your neighborhood, I'm really skeptical that that's going to be the kind of strategy that is really going to be able to win them back the suburbs. I think that in many respects, that's probably just a losing message overall. Now, of course, though, this feeds into the next major strategy which we saw coming out of the RNC, which is that of law and order. That was one of the major messaging points. After the shooting of Jacob Blake, what the RNC did and what we saw from Mike Pence was come out and talk about the fact that cities are supposedly burning, the fact that peaceful protest turned into violent mobs, they said, right? And so they want to focus in on the protest and not the cause of the protest, of course, and that's where things start to get really messy, because I'm not quite sure that a law and order message is really going to be the best thing. I mean, as much as a lot of people think that law and order messaging always works in America, that's actually not necessarily true. In fact, it's oftentimes hasn't worked, and I will admit also there is a pretty small sample size, but let's also be honest here. Law and order messaging has really only been used for insurgent candidates. It hasn't really been successful for incumbent presidents because there's this certain sense in which, you know, you're the incumbent, so law and order, that's kind of attached to you. The fact that there's a lack in law and order, how does that relate to Joe Biden? So I'm not quite sure that that message messaging is going to be necessarily super successful for the Republican Party. Now, of course, though, compared to the DNC, it is interesting, right? Like, I didn't necessarily have, I didn't think the DNC was all that great either. I really didn't. One of the things that we saw from the DNC was this idea of trying to target these sort of plugged in, high information moderates, right? So this idea was really trying to target the suburbs, I suppose, in some way. But again, the suburbs have really already swung to the Democrats. That is, of course, why they managed to pick up the House in 2018. Now, what's interesting, though, about the Democratic strategy is, again, they're trying to target these plugged-in swing voters or plugged-in moderates, though. But the thing about it, though, the thing that is, and this is really, really important for understanding politics, right? Swing voters are not necessarily moderates. Oftentimes, swing voters are voters who have positions all over the political spectrum, right? They might be far left in terms of healthcare. They might even support like an NHS-style system, but then they might be anti-trans, for example. They'll just have positions sort of all over the political spectrum, all over the map, and even if you might say in the aggregate they're in the middle, it doesn't mean necessarily that any particular moderate policy would be one which would appeal to those particular voters. But what the DNC tried to do, of course, was try to target plugged-in moderate voters by, bringing in people like John Kasich, bringing in people like John McCain's family, right? Like trying to target people who actually do have moderate down-the-line issues all the way across. So it's one of those strategies I was not particularly optimistic on because, again, plugged-in moderates are moderates who are plugged in. They're paying attention to politics, and they probably already swung to the Democrats. Again, how they won in 2018. So I didn't necessarily think that that was a particularly great strategy either. But if I'm comparing it to the RNC and their strategy of how they're targeting the suburbs and how they're trying to target this message of law and order and, again, vaguely linking it to the concern over the suburbs, I think the DNC strategy was probably better because, again, the moderates who are plugged in already swung. So it's not clear that the RNC, that the Republicans are going to be able to pick back up those moderates who already left. So I don't think overall the RNC really did themselves any major favors in terms of this convention, but I don't think the DNC did themselves any major favors overall either. I think that we will probably see a bit of a bump for Donald Trump. It might even be a bit of a bigger bump than what Joe Biden got, but I don't think that it's going to last particularly long. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to whether or not or in what way Donald Trump can handle COVID, right? Is there going to be a vaccine coming out by November? So far, doesn't look likely, but Donald Trump is claiming that, this is particularly possible, right? But if something like that happened, or if there's another black swan moment, if something else happened that's really, really big, it's possible that the polls could start to swing in favor of Donald Trump more so. But unless that happens, it probably won't overall. All right, you guys, that's the video. If you liked it, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.